Good afternoon. My name is Tim Lynch. I'm your host on Legal Lines. Legal Lines is brought to you by the Massachusetts LGBTQ Bar Association. We have an exciting program here today. If at any time you'd like to call in, please do. Our number here is 617-708-3290. Again, 617-708-3290. We're going to cover two issues, which are going to occur at the State House tomorrow. So this will be a great program to get up to speed on what's happening up there. First of all, first state in the country had a commission on LGBT aging, and they will do their presentation tomorrow. But Dr. Alex Coleman will tell us what that is, so we get an exclusive there, and he'll tell us what the commission was about and what they found and what kind of work they're going to be doing. Tomorrow is also a very important day, as people who've watched this program before know that there is a problem with respect to discrimination against transgender folks, particularly, unfortunately, with respect to accommodations. And tomorrow is Lobby Day on that very issue. So with us here today is Mason Dunn, and Mason is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Commission. And he will discuss what accommodations are, what does that word mean, and where we are in the struggle for transgender rights. How are you guys?
Good. Well. Good.
So I understand the presentation will be done first at the State House tomorrow.
Right, 10 o'clock tomorrow. Everybody's welcome. Room 428 on the Senate side, and it should be very exciting. The commission is the first of its kind, a statewide commission on LGBT aging. There was a requirement for one transgender person.
And I can't imagine a better person.
Well, you know, the clinical
honestly.
psychologist, lawyer, I keep saying they made me sign older transgender. I say, no, I will not sign it that way exclusively. You have to put down some of my other. But it was a very, very exciting and I think very well-run commission. It was headed up by Senator Pat Jalen and Representative Jim O'Day, who were very committed to doing a really good job. There were representatives from very high levels of the state departments, not just some underlings, many of whom themselves identify somewhere on the continuum, or close to, or as a strong ally of, but got the issues more or less, and also the private sector. So some of the groups that have been working, like some of the senior centers, associations, home health care, Ethos, Mason came to some of the meetings, the LGBT aging, Fenway was there. There were a lot of good people there, researchers, public health, housing. So basically what we did was, I kept them honest on the trans stuff. I was on every committee. You know, so I did a lot of work on it, but mostly people were responsive, and GLAAD was represented, again, lesbian advocates and defenders, and there are like several key recommendations in certain areas. So
I'm going to cut you off. Why did we need such a commission in the first place?
Because we're getting older.
We are getting older.
We're getting older.
It beats the alternative.
Yes, it does beat the alternative by a long shot. And basically, it's like, there are needs for services for LGBTQ people across the lifespan. There's no doubt about that. But for the aging population, we grew up in a different era. And where, like when I transitioned 22 years ago, I was like nearly run out of town on a rail, literally, in Brookline. And yet, a couple of years ago, I was able to get them to unanimously pass protections. So things are changing, but that doesn't mean that people still aren't harassed, and that people like me are still more wary about being more out. and about having to need services, so, intimate services, people taking care of my body. It's like, it's like bad enough in terms of like, well, sexual orientation issues, but, it's like, well, I don't want somebody to be freaking out about how my body might be different from what they expect it to be when I'm vulnerable and I can't take care of myself and do it myself. And I have, a child who's an adult who's very supportive, and, so I'm fortunate that way. But a lot of people either lost a lot of their relationships during the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
And have the trauma of going through the AIDS epidemic and still continuing. That a lot of people, even though now many people can marry, there are still people who are hesitant to because of their family relationships, because of the stigma and the history that they have about being ostracized and traumatized and beat up and excluded. Places of worship that are often places where older folks might find some solace or a companionship or whatever, especially if their significant other, if they have a significant other, passes away before them or becomes incapacitated before them, aren't as friendly as they might be. I mean, and that's certainly true for trans people. It's even more true. I mean, it's even more true for trans people, I think, but it's certainly true for gay and lesbian people, gender queer people, and for people who are bisexual, who may or may not be open about being bisexual. And so this commission really looked at it from a service delivery point of view. And one of the great things about it is that by looking at this population, that there are a lot of other populations that are underserved populations. And so a lot of the recommendations we have will help them. So for example, virtual senior centers.
What do you mean virtual senior
people have
centers?
trouble getting to senior centers. Like, it's like in Brookline, there's a senior center. It's a densely populated area of public transportation. You go out to the western part of the state, you don't have that. So we were talking about setting up regional centers where there can be some activities, maybe not at every senior center to start with, but that with technology, people who are isolated, who may not be willing to come out, or who may need transportation to get there and don't want to be out to the people who are providing the transportation, can participate in certain kinds of activities. And one big thing, and I'm just going to segue into Mason, is one of our recommendations, well, two significant ones, is that the legislation for transgender equality and access to public accommodation on equal footing with everybody else. And public accommodations, as Mason will tell you, is everything from going to a hospital, to going on the T, to going to a movie theater, a restaurant, any place of business, coming here to the TV station.
So let's segue to Mason,
Sure.
because this is an important issue. I mean, we've talked about aging and people feeling vulnerable, and you're more vulnerable obviously when you're older and you're frail and unable to defend yourself. But when we come to your issue, Mason, we're talking about everybody of all ages, right, and of what's happening to transgender folks. Why don't we first start out with where we are on transgender equal rights in Massachusetts?
Yeah, it's easier to start with where we're at and then where we're going or where we need to go. So back in 2011, we passed a really significant piece of legislation that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity, which is to say that you cannot discriminate against transgender people in employment, housing, credit and lending. It also added gender identity to the statewide hate crimes law, and that same year we passed non-discrimination protections for education, public education. Now, originally part of that legislation was public accommodations, which is just a fancy legal way of saying public spaces, any public space. That was originally a part of that non-discrimination bill that unfortunately got taken out as we were approaching passage. So we have these fantastic protections already established back in 2011, but now we're coming back for that public accommodation piece to ensure that not only is discrimination prohibited in all the places that we already have, the employment and the housing and education, but the places that we are between home and those places. When we're getting to work and we take the T, when we're getting to school and we take the bus, when we're out after school to go to a movie theater, when we're sick and we're in the hospital. All of these places are public spaces, and therefore discrimination is legally allowed, and that needs to change.
And
Fenway
that's
Park.
always, my favorite place.
Although there are protections actually in Boston.
There are
so-
protections in Boston, and the Red Sox and the Patriots have always been leaders
Yeah, they have.
in this community and in protection. So we appreciate, go Boston.
Yeah.
But getting back to this issue of transgender rights, and I've said this before in the program, is so in other words, a place that serves coffee or a restaurant cannot discriminate in hiring a transgender person, but can tell that transgender server to in fact discriminate against serving transgender people.
And this really points out some of the legal arguments that we use. This inconsistent law is really bad for business and bad for employers, that you tell them that they cannot discriminate in their employment practices, but they can discriminate across the counter. That's bad law and needs to be remedied. And so it is inconsistent law that we are working to make consistent, make clear. It's not only good for the trans community and the larger LGBTQ community, but it's also really good for business.
And
in
you have
fact-
business support too.
In fact, I was just going to say that Kathy Rubin, who we know very well, and who's
Wonderful
been on the
attorney.
show, who is an employment attorney for employers, repeatedly points out, and the bar associations have unanimously, both labor and management, supported this legislation because it makes good business sense.
It is.
It clarifies what people need to do. It's more inclusive, so you have more customers, and it keeps you out of legal trouble.
Well, and may I also add to that,
Please.
that it's really important to attract the best candidates for jobs. And this is another place where it's good for business.
Absolutely.
If I know that I can move to Massachusetts as a trans person and not have to deal with employment discrimination, that is prohibited. That's great. Then that's an incentive for me to move to Massachusetts and work for some of these large Massachusetts companies like Biogen, like Raytheon, like so many others that are some of the largest employers here in this state. But then I look at the state of the law and realize, well, it's great that my employer can't discriminate against me, but when I go out to the movie with my family, when I am on the T, there I can be discriminated against. Well, now I'm rethinking a move to Boston. And now my candidacy for this job is in question because I don't want to even think about moving to a state that doesn't have these protections.
Well, I think it creates and as I understand it, many businesses have come out overwhelmingly in favor of this.
Yes.
And I think it speaks to the fact that it's not simply, this law doesn't simply affect the transgender community. It affects the whole community. I mean, they've done studies that show that when you have communities that do not have discrimination or outlaw discrimination, heterosexual families move in there because there's a perception that it's a safe, welcoming environment, and that's where people want to raise their kids.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, what's interesting is that as we look at, whether it's women's rights or civil, rights in terms of, voting rights and that type of thing, the gay rights, so-called, bill, as people had more protections, they are more visible. As they're more visible, they're more known. As they're more known, they're less alien.
There was alien people say, "Oh, I didn't know you were transgender. I didn't
Right,
know you were gay. Gee, you're a nice person."
Right.
That
Despite
changes,
that, right.
that changes my view. I've had that many times said to
Likewise.
me, "You're a
Absolutely.
nice guy."